Like most of the institutions of the global financial system as they exist today, the BIS has a very strong historical Western legacy. And there is no doubt that the perspectives of the banking institutions from the collective West continue to play a very strong role in determining the focus and operational priorities of the BIS itself.
Welcome, everyone. Today, I'm very excited to welcome back Warwick Powell. Warwick is an adjunct professor at Queensland University in Australia, working at the intersection of digital technologies, supply chains, and global political economy and governance. Warwick also runs a wonderful Substack. I have been a big fan of his. I've been a subscriber for probably over a year to your Substack. I highly, highly recommend it. I will link it in the description below. Warwick, it's so great to see you again. Thank you for taking the time.
Happy to be here again, Lena.
Great to have you. Last time when we spoke, we discussed Project mBRIDGE in the context of the Global South creating an alternative financial system. Recently, there have been very controversial reports regarding the involvement of the Bank for International Settlements. The BIS top executive, Augustin Carstens, recently said that, and it was quite a, all of a sudden statement. He indicated that the BIS cannot work with sanctioned countries, therefore effectively hinting at the blockchain-based Project mBRIDGE being shut down. Without a doubt, this may be sort of a setback for the BRICS plus bloc's ability to launch a new financial settlement platform. For those of our viewers who may be new to the topic, could you share a high-level overview, what mBRIDGE is, and why it is so important for BRICS before we get into the specifics and the recent developments?
Sure. mBRIDGE is a technology innovation project that was kicked off in 2021 under the umbrella of the Bank of International Settlements. Now, the Bank of International Settlements is an organization that has over 60 international central banks as its members or as its owners, so to speak. And it fulfills a broad range of roles within the global financial institutional landscape. One of those roles is to curate projects that enable the development and the exploration of new financial technologies and how they may be relevant to and impact on issues of concern to the central banking community. One of the big issues that has been on the drawing board for many years is the question of cross-border settlements. How is it that cross-border settlements can be made more efficient, cheaper and quicker, as well as more secure for participating countries? And this question of cross-border settlements has dogged global banking for many, many decades. The ways in which the current arrangements tend to operate is, of course, through bank-to-bank relationships, where banks exchange messages with each other over a secure network, SWIFT mainly, so that the counterparty banks can make adjustments to the ledgers that they are responsible for, where on the one side, we have minuses taking place. We're reducing the balances within certain accounts. And on the other side, we are adding to the balances in other accounts. So these are the mechanisms by which cross-border transactions are undertaken. We have an environment where a party in country A is engaging in a transaction with a party in country B. The country A party has a relationship with their own commercial bank. That commercial bank has accounts at the central bank in country A, and the same thing happens in mirror on the other side of the border. The way that transactions work is that the transacting parties are essentially giving instructions to their commercial banks. The commercial banks are then providing messages or instructions to the central banks who ultimately settle the accounts. That's what's been going on historically. What that means is that there are significant bottlenecks through the SWIFT network, and bottlenecks in terms of the ways in which the central banks themselves make the adjustments to the ledgers and ultimately reconcile those adjustments. This mBRIDGE project was a project that was conceptualized to address some of the challenges in cross-border payment settlement. And that project sought to explore how distributed ledger technologies, and particularly blockchains, could be used to overcome the problems of, excuse me, the problems of the slowness in that process that I described earlier, the costs involved in that process from transaction fees point of view, and also from foreign exchange risk point of view, and also how a system could be designed that would reduce the risk that transacting parties could have their transactions curtailed by third parties. Oh, I hope your viewers can forgive my cough. So the project kicked off in 2021, and it involved a cornerstone of participating central banks: the Monetary Authority of Hong Kong, People's Bank of China, the Central Bank of the UAE, and the Central Bank of Thailand, together with the BIS. There was also a range of other central banks and affiliated organisations as observers to the project, about 29 or so other organisations, something like that. And the project kicked off, and a first version technology stack was developed, which used blockchains as its foundation. The way blockchains in this case works is that each of the participating central banks is responsible for operating a node which has the authority to participate in the updating of the ledger. So each of those participating central banks operates a node which is interconnected with each other and which synchronizes with each other to maintain a consistency of record across that set of duplicate ledgers. The commercial banks that are involved, which are connected to their respective central banks, also operate nodes, but those nodes don't have the ability to update the ledger. They only have the ability to keep a copy of what's been updated by the central banks. So that was the basic architecture. And associated with that technical architecture was the development of what you'd call the off-chain governance protocols, and a whole array of participation agreements have been developed that govern how the central banks participate in the project, what rights they have in relation to updating the systems, updating data, operating nodes, what rights and obligations the participating commercial banks have. So it's a whole non-technical set of legal arrangements that enable these organizations to come together and operate this ecosystem. Updating technologies in terms of whether it's a consensus mechanism, how the blockchain works, or applications on top of that, the ways in which different banks use the system, it can only be undertaken when the network of banks actually agree to the updates. So no single bank can go forth and change any of the software applications without everyone else agreeing to it. That project implemented a whole bunch of trials towards the end of 2022, which were successful. They enabled cross-border transactions with real value to be tracked. And after that, the project then underwent a period of essentially a rebuild, almost a rebuild for a new version. And as part of that rebuild in 2023, the project rewrote the consensus algorithms for the blockchain itself to improve efficiency, finality, and other range of performance metrics so that the blockchain itself just worked better for the participating banks. As part of the improvement, I guess, on version 1 proof of concept, the project then moved into launching a minimum viable product, which they did in around the middle of this year. And that minimum viable product is now in use. So the participating banks are using that infrastructure to support cross-border transactions. In the meantime, the Central Bank of Saudi Arabia also changed the status of their involvement from being one of the observers to being one of the active partners, and they are now also running a banking node. So we have an ecosystem. Where we're at today is we have a functional ecosystem operating a minimum viable product with 5 national central banks being responsible for running the nodes. That's where we're at. What you mentioned is some remarks and a report from that suggested that the BIS was going to now pull the plug on the project. There has been a little bit more clarity in the last few days, and that is that the BIS curated the project, but as the very nature of the project shows, the whole point was to create an infrastructure in which no single participant could pull the plug on it. And that's exactly what we've now got. So the BIS has reached a point, and from its own sort of communications, and people will have a view as to why it's moving down this path. But in essence, it's saying there's no real need for us to be involved any longer. The banks can now take over. We've fulfilled our core role, which was to catalyze the project and bring the parties together within an environment where they could collaborate. We've created a research environment around it from which a bunch of learnings have emerged. And so we've done our bit. Obviously, the concerns around being exposed to, I guess, the dynamics and risks of geopolitics also weighs heavily on the BIS itself. And so you have very explicit commentary around not wanting to and not being able to work with sanctioned institutions. And these things are not incompatible, of course. You know, it could be for all of these reasons as to why the BIS is now taking a step back. The most important thing, though, is that the project itself can't be stopped unless participating banks want to stop.
It is absolutely fascinating. Thank you so much for walking us through how it works and the functionalities. So as you mentioned, the project started through the BIS Innovation Hub. It was first initiated by China, Hong Kong, Thailand, and the UAE. Then Saudi Arabia joined. As you mentioned, the BIS is run by member banks, and each bank has its own voting power that is sort of allocated to it. And it was only after the IMF meeting that was held in late October that the BIS said, well, wait a minute, we don't want to work with those countries that are sanctioned by the United States and the EU. So how much say do Western financial institutions, Western banks, have in the affairs of the BIS related to non-Western banks?
Like most of the institutions of the global financial system as they exist today, the BIS has a very strong historical Western legacy. And there is no doubt that the perspectives of the banking institutions from the collective West continue to play a very strong role in determining the focus and operational priorities of the BIS itself. Now, the BIS is run by a board of directors. It has, general meetings. There's a management. It has about 600 staff across the world. So it's actually not a particularly large organization. 600 staff is quite small. And I think it's probably useful to also understand its evolving role historically. In times past, as the Bank of International Settlements, it played a very important role in enabling the settlements between central banks, bank-to-bank settlements. However, as the global financial system evolved over the last 70 years, that role has become less important because banks are able to achieve the liquidity that they need and to achieve the settlements that they need without necessarily having the BIS involved in those matters. So the BIS, in many regards, has evolved into a central banker's think tank in some respects, where it runs a lot of initiatives around economic analysis, policy analysis, policy research, innovation research in terms of new technologies. So much so that it now has this innovation hub, which is the group that spearheads the development of research in innovation activities. So, in some respects, Lena, the BIS is much more of a think tank kind of organisation today than a banker's settlement institution as it once was.
About 2 weeks ago, I think it has been 2 weeks, maybe 1 week, Bloomberg published an article titled BIS Debates Ending Project Eyed by Putin to Undermine Dollar. So the verbiage was really, really interesting. What were your initial thoughts when you read about this and how mBRIDGE was effectively presented to Bloomberg's readers in terms of being presented as a tool to undermine the dollar, and somehow they, of course, had to throw in Putin's name in the mix too?
Look, there has always been a lot of chatter about whether or not mBRIDGE as a project would feature in the emerging BRICS settlement system. Now, that has always been chatter. My own view has been that from day one, mBRIDGE was never going to be in and of itself the BRICS settlement system or the BRICS payment system for a whole lot of reasons. Firstly, that some of the nodes are run by banks that come from countries that are not members of BRICS. That's one of the reasons. Of course, there are significant overlaps now too. People's Bank of China, Bank of Thailand, and the UAE being the notable three participants. They're all BRICS members as well. But nonetheless, the mBRIDGE project was never designed to be a BRICS project. So it had no inherent reason to prohibit non-BRICS countries and their banks from being involved. So in that sense, mBRIDGE was never going to be the BRICS solution. Having said that, the fact that there are significant membership overlaps between the mBRIDGE project's core banking participants, as well as some of the observers, and the members of BRICS, would lead one to suggest that the learnings from the mBRIDGE project would ultimately, in one shape or another, find their way into the design thinking of the BRICS settlement and cross-border payments system. And I suspect that that is going to be very likely. I think it's actually more likely now that the BIS is stepping back from the mBRIDGE project than had the BIS stayed involved in the mBRIDGE project. It's likely, for example, that the BRICS initiative, BRICS Clear, will draw considerably from the technical design learnings of the mBRIDGE project, as well as probably learn quite a lot from the non-technical legal governance framework that has been developed in parallel with mBRIDGE. So there's a lot that mBRIDGE has done that BRICS could make use of, and I think is likely to make use of. Vladimir Putin has actually never, to my knowledge, said anything that would suggest that from Russia's point of view, let alone BRICS's point of view, that mBRIDGE was the BRICS payment solution. They've never said that. And the Bloomberg report is in many regards one could say, quite mischievous in trying to conflate these different things to create the impression that that mBRIDGE itself was a geopolitical project, when in fact it was a project that emerged really prior to, for instance, the outbreak of the Ukraine war and the explicit spilling over of geopolitical tension. Remember, mBRIDGE began in 2021. The world was a little bit different then. It wasn't quite as spicy as it is today. And the initiative really was, I think, looking for ways to streamline what was historically, or what has become, quite an outdated legacy architecture. It was slow and expensive. Since then, the geopolitical dynamics in the world have kind of overtaken a more technical consideration of the project, and it is a little easy to sort of fold it all together as if it becomes, mashed into one set of things. But my own sense is that, firstly, the history of mBRIDGE was it wasn't really a geopolitical initiative. Secondly, mBRIDGE was never identified by BRICS or by Russia as a BRICS solution. But having said that, with the stepping back of the BIS from the project, in some respects, it clears the institutional way for the learnings from mBRIDGE to become part and parcel of BRICS' own BRICS Clear solution.
So let's say the BIS does fully withdraw. What happens to Project mBRIDGE?
Well, Project mBRIDGE will continue. This is in some ways proof positive of why distributed technologies, together with a consensus-based governance arrangement, can survive the decisions of individual actors. The concern, particularly in the post-weaponization of the US dollar system context, has always been that individual countries can exert sufficient influence and power over system infrastructure to prohibit others from using it, to be able to capriciously intervene in someone's account, either by blocking someone's ability to access that account, or actually stealing from that account, transferring those resources from one account to another. And that, of course, has taken place in relation to the US dollar reserves of the Afghan Central Bank, Venezuela, and other countries. And of course, more recently, the ongoing discussions about how to make use of the frozen US dollar and euro denominated assets of the Russian central bank, so as to provide finance to the Western war effort in Ukraine. So mBRIDGE actually demonstrates how technologies, in terms of computers and software, coupled with a legal framework, can overcome the problems of unilateral sanctions and unilateral prohibitions. The project, for all intents and purposes, will continue. It will continue because it has demonstrated that it can work. It has an MVP that is active and is supporting real value transactions. And there are commitments from the participating institutions to explore how the technology can be further improved so as to support cheaper, more efficient, quicker, and more secure cross-border transactions. So mBRIDGE, I think, is, for the time being, here to stay. mBRIDGE will only fold if the participating banks decide that it doesn't meet their needs.
One of the key takeaways this year under Russian chairmanship has been the establishment of a certain degree of governance structure within the BRICS bloc members. Anyone who reads the Kazan Declaration will notice that they established a range of institutions within the BRICS Plus bloc, such as BRICS Contingent Reserve Arrangement, BRICS Interbank Cooperation Mechanism, among many others. So they have made substantial progress this year in laying that groundwork for future intentional growth. What are the main challenges right now, would you say, to the development of the BRICS Plus financial platform? And do you anticipate any progress within the next 12 months?
I think there's no, in principle, reasons why there can't be significant progress made in the next 12 months. In part because the initiative around BRICS Clear and its associated institutions is not taking place in an historical vacuum, and is certainly not working on the basis of it being a blank sheet of paper. As mentioned, the mBRIDGE project will provide substantial learnings for technology and legal design. It also opens up important questions around how liquidity questions and price discovery or exchange rate questions are to be resolved. In the mBRIDGE environment, the exchange question is resolved by the transacting parties themselves agreeing the relevant exchange rate for the transaction. So there is no inherent price discovery mechanism through some foreign exchange process. Now, that's not a criticism, it's just a description of how it goes about doing its particular kind of business. The BRICS question is always going to need to take things another step further. And the Kazan Declaration, read together with the discussion paper that was released about a week before the Kazan summit, clearly indicates that the financial authorities recognize that there is a need to think through how to ensure sufficient liquidity within the system so that the banks that are participating in this system can settle the accounts when they come due. And one of the mechanisms that they're looking at is to extend the reserve system that they have already created and have been operating, and to make that bigger and to play a greater role in the ways in which this intra-BRICS system will function. This will mean that the new development bank, the BRICS Bank that was created some 10 years ago, will continue to expand its role within the overall BRICS financial architecture. So this particular set of mechanisms, in effect, is the BRICS alternative to the IMF. It doesn't have to say that to function as the equivalent, because it fulfills that lender of last resort function, so to speak, that enables the banks to settle their accounts overnight with each other. And so BRICS is going to need to think through this. BRICS clearly has also indicated that it will be developing and expanding a reinsurance scheme to support cross-border trade finance and cross-border trade transactions in the event that, things go wrong. And that's a very important piece of the risk management architecture that will be put into place. You can't just have a financial payment system without an insurance mechanism in the event that something goes wrong, either in the real world, such as containers falling off ships, or there being problems with the ability of counterparties to settle their accounts for one reason or another. And it could even be force majeure reasons. So insurance schemes will need to be thought through as to how that plays a role to make sure that the system can function in a stable way. The last issue that I think BRICS is going to be addressing is the question of how to govern and determine the exchange rate between the different national currencies. Got to remember that the BRICS payment system was always designed or intended to be designed to enable the expanded use of national currencies for trade settlements, not the creation of a new currency. Okay. And you go back through the BRICS documentation over the last few years, as well as the statements of the various leaders of BRICS countries, and this has always been the fundamental objective. It wasn't to create a new currency. It was to enable national currencies to play a more prominent and expanded role in cross-border trade settlements. And so this question of the exchange rate, or to ensure that exchanges of equivalence are taking place, will become an important part of the deliberations this year. And there's quite a number of ways in which they could go about addressing this. Reading between the lines of the declaration, and again the discussion paper that came out before Kazan, I have a sense that the thinking is leaning towards the creation of a kind of an administrative numeraire. So it's not a currency per se, but it's a common benchmark against which all currencies relate, and that the adjustment mechanism to adjust the relationship between a national currency and the common benchmark will be determined most likely through consensus rather than through some other mechanism. So we're not going to see the emergence of a foreign exchange market that somehow enables the trading of this numeraire. It's really an administrative and an accounting mechanism that will be implemented so that there can be stability in the exchange relationships between the different countries. You've also probably noticed, Lena, that the declaration speaks about extending the commodities market that Russia has been running to enable it to become a BRICS commodities market. And that's an important feature within the way that BRICS thinks about these issues. It isn't thinking about financial issues in isolation from what happens in the real economy. And the inclusion and expansion of the commodities market platform is to lend a genuine, functional, value-driven infrastructure to this idea of creating a financial architecture that can facilitate trade. So there is, I guess, in some ways, a view, even though it's not always explicitly articulated as such, that the financial architecture must be developed in ways that support the exchange of real value or use values within a real economy rather than being developed for its own sake. It must support the real economy. And of course, for BRICS countries, a really important part of their respective real economies is their commodities industries. So, that's a very important feature of the Kazan Declaration as well.
I'm very curious to learn more about the grains exchange. I think that will be a really interesting development and something that will really help the countries sort of move forward and establish closer ties and really kind of make sure that they have that cross-border cooperation and aligned trade to address perhaps, food security issues and human security issues. I think that will be really interesting. Warwick, you mentioned that China, Hong Kong, Thailand, and the UAE were among the founding members of the mBRIDGE project. What role will China play in the development of mBRIDGE going forward now that the BIS is likely going to step away?
China's the biggest trading partner of 140 odd countries in the world. It is the biggest trading partner of BRICS member states. So insofar as having a real economy that underpins the development of a financial architecture is concerned, China will continue to, I guess, play a very significant role because of that. It's also worth noting that the software development on the mBRIDGE consensus mechanism on the blockchain was actually developed by a Chinese team. So Chinese software developers have already been playing an important role in the development of the technical infrastructure that we've now seen unfold as a functional MVP. The sheer scale of China, I think, means that it will always play a very important role. The question is whether or not the question really is how a single country contributes to an ecosystem that has been specifically designed to ensure that no single country can necessarily dominate. And that's a really important design feature and design ethos of BRICS itself. BRICS is often criticized for not having a secretariat and not having a permanent bureaucracy and those sorts of things. But in fact, that's the source of its own uniqueness and its own strength, because it compels member organizations to make the effort to negotiate with each other and to find consensus amongst the participating members before they can move forward. And that's, I guess, is a way of thinking and a way of doing things that perhaps is a little bit foreign to how the collective West has become accustomed to global institutions doing their thing, such as the IMF and the World Bank, where the collective Western nations continue to dominate the decision-making processes. So I think China will play an important role in two main respects. One is it will be a technology contributor significantly, and of course it is a critical contributor at a real economy level as well. But BRICS itself is bigger than one country.
Absolutely. During the summit in Kazan, Brazilian President Lula was notably missing, and he, of course, sent his foreign minister, I believe. So Brazil was represented. However, he was one of the heads of state that was not in attendance, and he is, of course, one of the founding members. And next year, in 2025, Brazil will be the chair of the bloc. Many people read into his absence at the summit, and they also are somewhat surprised that Brazil appeared to block Venezuela's partner status in the bloc. So, what is your take on those events, and what do you feel is what is going on with Brazil, sort of maybe not acting as we would expect it to?
Well, international relationships are always complicated by not only the relationship between countries, but also domestic political considerations as well. And in some ways, you sort of think about these as wheels inside wheels. I wouldn't read too much into these things, because at the end of the day, again, BRICS is bigger than one country. The institutional building that came out of the 2024 summit, I think, really emphasized this sense that BRICS is here to stay, and it is working through an institution building and consolidation process to come up with unique ways of ensuring sustainability and longevity without creating big bureaucracies, dominated by any one particular member state. So I think that that's worth bearing in mind. The other interesting thing about the Brazil situation is that Brazil is chairing this year's G20, right? So it's going to have a busy year this year, and arguably a busy year next year. And the spotlight will be on Brazil in terms of the extent to which Brazil and President Lula will be able to progress the agenda on important issues that relate to concerns of the global South. As you know, President Lula has asked on quite a number of occasions, rhetorically in a sense, why is it that when Brazil trades with another country in Latin America, we use the US dollar? And I think that there is a desire from Brazil's point of view to expand the capacity of trade to be undertaken without the US dollar. So there is, in many regards, an alignment of national interest with the broader interests of the other BRICS countries, unsurprisingly. President Lula has also made a big deal in the last few months in relation to the G20, and I would expect that he would take this into BRICS next year, around issues of international institutional reform, particularly as far as the voices of the global south on existing institutions, the IMF, the World Bank in particular, as well as potentially reform of the United Nations itself and the Security Council. He's also made a lot of noises about the issues of global inequity and food security and starvation. Now, those issues have become actually more pronounced over the last few years, and they are big challenges as far as the development ambitions and the basic quality of life ambitions of countries of the global south. And the last issue that Lula has made, I think, quite a lot of noise about, as far as it being, one of the focal point issues, is the energy transition and the fairness of the energy transition. And energy transition is actually a very important issue, because not only does it relate to the agreements that countries arrived at the Paris Accord some years ago in relation to climate change, but they also relate to ambitions that nations have to become more energy sovereign. So renewable energy infrastructure does enable nation states to become less dependent upon energy imported from other places. And energy sovereignty is as much a geopolitical concern as it is a developmental imperative for countries of the global south. Lula has plenty on his plate, and I think these big issues ultimately will overdetermine the smaller issues of the geopolitical relationship between one country and another. At the end of the day, these are the things that ultimately matter.
And maybe the last question, with respect to the development of a BRICS financial settlement platform, what progress do you anticipate under the chairmanship of Brazil in 2025?
It's conceivable that a proof of concept could be up and running. It's conceivable that there will be a set of operational protocols and agreements that will govern the ways in which this infrastructure will be developed, upgraded, modified, and implemented. There is no in principle reason, and certainly no technological reason, why enhanced national currency-based cross-border settlements and payments amongst BRICS members can't actually be accomplished within the next 12 months or so, certainly to a point of having functional proof of concepts, sandboxes, if you will, in which the respective central banks and participating commercial banks can undertake real-world testing of systems, processes, and ultimately to undertake the kinds of user-based evaluations that they will need to do before going live. But there is no technical reason why you can't have those things happen within the next 12 months. And the reason I say that is because, over the last 10 years or so, there has been a huge amount of work done around the world on payment systems, on distributed ledger technologies such as mBRIDGE, from which other countries can learn. And of course, we have an array of existing mechanisms that were developed to address these issues of risks of censorship and risks of sanctioning from the first half of the 2010s, such as the messaging systems developed by China and Russia, the payments infrastructure, universal payments protocols developed by India, the swap arrangements that have been put in place between the Chinese central bank and the central banks of, I think, about 29 other countries. India's doing the same. Russia's doing the same. So there's a whole bunch of infrastructure that is already in place to support currency multipolarity, and this development of a narrowly defined technical infrastructure is just another piece of that jigsaw puzzle.
Warwick, thank you so much for joining today and for such an interesting conversation. I learned so much from you today. I would love to connect with you once again once we hear more on this topic.
Absolute pleasure. Good to be here.